Reasons to improve your public speaking include speaking at conferences can be very exciting. I'm very, very excited right now. You'll feel more confident speaking at your workplace. Everybody likes to increase their revenue and their bottom line. And your slides won't look like horse shit. So this is the talk on talks. It's the most meta talk of all talks today, where my talk is about a talk that you can give in talk form. So there'll be lots of jokes that are self-referential. It's awesome, just go with it. They asked me to kind of give a talk here that was a little bit different from more traditionally tech-oriented talk. Probably because if you learn too much about CSS, your ears start bleeding and you need a little bit of a break in the middle of all of your conference sort of stuff. So I want to talk about public speaking, because I think it's kind of interesting. I want everybody in here to give a talk at a conference or a meetup or whatever the case is, but even if that's not what you ultimately want to do, I think the more you can learn about how to become a better public speaker, the better. Because everyone kind of runs into situations at their workplace, or even if you're giving a talk at your friend's wedding or something, where it's helpful to learn a little bit more about how do I present my idea so I can get people to do what I want them to do. So those are always good things to do, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm Zach Holman, Holman on Twitter and all those sort of things. For about the last 5 years, up until the beginning of this year, I worked at GitHub. I was a developer on pretty much everything that you use at GitHub. And as part of my job or something like that, it turned into where I realized I like giving talks. I would go and talk about software development, and I realized I didn't necessarily hate it. And I picked up a lot of tips along the way of what makes for good public speaking and stuff. So I made this website called speaking.io. And this is kind of a companion talk to that website about talks. And you can check this out later. It's in more of a blog form if you want to read things as opposed to hearing me drone on and on and on about stuff. But yeah, there's 3 things I want to talk about today. Just 3 things, nothing more, nothing less. The first little section of my talk is called the planning section. How do you plan out a talk? How do you figure out what you want to talk about? And then the next section, you actually have to build that talk, try and figure out, okay, how do I put my thoughts into actions? And then finally, you have to give the actual talk. You can't just make a cool talk and then show nobody, because what's the point of that? So the first little bit, the planning section. This is, the first step is sometimes the hardest, right? First thing I always say, start early. I won't point any fingers, but I guarantee someone at this conference probably gave a talk today or is giving a talk today and didn't finish their talk until last night, this morning, right before they got up on stage. I'm still working on my talk right now. You just can't see it. You can never start too early. Everyone cool has a rule, so I want to be cool too. And just say talk preparation will expand to fill all available time. Even if the conference or meetup or whatever you're talking at is like 6 months away, that just means you have 6 months to say, oh, it's 5 months away. Oh, it's 4 months away. It's 2 weeks away. Crap. I should have started earlier. So the first thing, start thinking about this stuff early. The next kind of big question is, well, what sort of event should I talk at? Maybe I want to talk about some cool framework I used or some new technology or technique I've discovered. Where do I want to share that? And a good way to sort of figure that out, especially if you aren't practiced at this, if you're new to giving talks, is try and look at the stress levels. And the first place I think that I recommend people to give talks at is at work, especially if you tend to like the coworkers you work with. If you don't like your coworkers, this may be problematic. But if you do like your coworkers, this is usually a good way to say, it has a nice atmosphere for people to support you and give you good feedback without making you feel like a horrible person if they didn't necessarily like it all the way. A lot of companies will do different things if you say, okay, I have a conference coming up in a couple weeks. I want to do a run through with my coworkers. Who wants to kind of come check it out, give me feedback. I think that's like the best thing you could do internally just from a culture perspective, is to encourage people and give them constructive criticism and help everyone grow that way. The next, I think, a lightning talk. If you're at a conference that has lightning talks or meetups or whatever, these little short 5-minute talks, and usually only 5 minutes, you can't go any further than that, and then they cut you off and pull you off stage. It's great because you have a time box limited thing you can say, and it makes it a lot more simpler. This is a nice, easy way to get into talking in front of strangers without feeling a whole bunch of stress, although there can certainly be a lot of stress as well with that. Meetups are usually the next step up. Lots of local meetups in pretty much every city in the world. Go to meetup.com or any of these other sites. Find a local meetup group. They're usually very, very welcoming and friendly and let you talk about what you're super interested in. And then you can meet other people who are interested in that, and it's just great. Kind of the next level, a conference. Really scary. Sometimes, depending on the conference, if it's even if it's a 50-person conference or a 1,000-person conference, that can have a lot of stress. So I recommend kind of jumping into that a little bit slow. Obviously, the next step would be inside the war room at the White House. If you're giving a talk there, good luck. And then finally, the first time you meet your partner's mother, that is going to be the most stressful out of any of them. So good luck with that as well. Next, picking up the topic. This is kind of I get this question a lot, like, oh, what should I speak about? There's so many things. I don't know, what can I give for other people that they could learn from? And that's a good question. It's a good question to ask. My advice is you should be an expert in that topic. This is a little bit more complicated statement. So what do I mean by that? I think you should have some sort of particular experience or something where you can come away from and say, yeah, this is something that I can teach to other people. And the reason why I kind of point this out is that you can be an expert in something, but not a traditional expert in that. So, for example, I saw a Ruby on Rails talk a couple years back, and I've done Rails for almost a decade at this point, so I know Rails pretty well. But this person gave a talk where he basically said, okay, I've never programmed before, and I've picked up Rails in the last 2 months. This is what I've learned. So even though he's not an expert in Ruby on Rails, for example, he's an expert on learning about programming, learning about Ruby on Rails, whatever the case is. And that was interesting to me, even though I may have an objective, I've worked with it longer than they have. It was really fascinating for me to hear somebody else's experience because they're an expert on being a newbie to something that I've used a lot before. And it changed my opinion on how I should develop code. So that's a long-winded way of saying, like, what can you bring to the table that's unique? It doesn't necessarily, you have to be the best person in the world. Maybe you've looked at 10 different JavaScript frameworks in the last 2 months, and now you're an expert at comparing and contrasting between all of them. That'd be a great talk to do. The other thing along those lines is I think research-based talks are a horrible idea. What I mean by this is, yeah, I'm sort of learning this now, and in 4 months, I am going to be smart enough to give a talk on this. I really suggest you never do this, because what usually ends up happening is, again, 2 or 3 months, spin up, and then it's becoming time to give your talk, and you realize you don't really know anything, and you're like, oh crap, I shouldn't have given this talk. This happened to me once. I had a really genius idea like 4 or 5 years ago. I was going to spider most of GitHub, and I was going to come up with what makes a good software project? Is it somebody who accepts a lot of pull requests, or how do you write your code? Does that make it more accessible for people to contribute back? Does that translate into watchers and stars and all those fun social metrics? So I started on this like 7 or 8 months ahead of time, and then it quickly became apparent that I just had no time to do what the talk required. So this is a big, long-winded way of saying I think the best way to do things is to consider your talks as a retrospective. Like, this is what I learned, as opposed to this is what I'm going to learn in the next X months when my talk is going to happen. Once you figure out what you want to do, the first step for me is outlining. This is a way for me to get my ideas out onto paper and start making this an actual real thing. And for me, there's a lot of different ways to give talks, but I like the idea of a rule of 3. I think the reason I like this is that human concentration is pretty crappy. Like, even now, there's probably people in the audience with their phones out, and they're like, I'm listening to this guy talk, but there's some stuff on the Twitters that's really important for me or something. That's what happens. And I think if you split up your talk into 3 main points and just keep hammering away at all 3 of those main points, it's much simpler than doing like 10 different directions and trying to have everyone remember what you're trying to say. So I start out usually with a piece of paper or a document or something. I just put out 3 main sections. These are 3 main ideas about the talk that I think are important for other people to understand about this. In this case, in this particular talk, I have planning, building, and delivering. Those are my 3 things I'm going to try and hit, and that's how I start out. And then I add an intro and an outro, and that's effectively my whole talk. At this point, I kind of dig down at each individual section and start adding supporting points. I'm not trying to think anything more about like what place they should be or anything like that. I just go one by one. What should I put in this section? What I think is interesting in this section? And I just kind of jump back and forth. At this point, I'll sit back for sometimes even a day or two and say like, okay, do I have enough in section 1? Or is there anything in section 3? If there isn't, maybe I want to start moving around the talk. Remember, it's a lot easier to change your talk when it's on paper as opposed to in a 200 slide deck and you suddenly realize, oh, you're in trouble. At this point, I'll just expand these into slides. If I have all these supporting points, these effectively are slides, or maybe a group of 4 slides that all depend on the supporting point. And that's about it. That's how I go from the idea of like, oh, I think this would be kind of interesting, to these are a bunch of slides that I want to talk about. The other aspect behind this is aim for more content than you need. As you get up on stage, you're going to speak a lot faster than you speak in your bathroom or wherever you're doing your practice talking. And it's a lot easier to cut things out than it is to try and pad it right before your talk goes up. The next thing I want to talk about is repetition. As Harry talked about in the last talk, and we all remember what he talked about, the dry principle, right? It's do repeat yourself as much as possible. At least if you're on stage, repeating yourself, totally awesome. This is not code. I think being dry in the programming sense is silly when you're on stage. And the reason I say that is I think the best talks are stories. I think it's a way of telling you something that happened to you or your thoughts on something. It's not saying like, oh, this is, you do A, then you do B, then you do C. And it's like, okay, that's a little bit boring. If you give a talk or if you tell a story about the experience that you just went through, far more interesting, and that's what the type of thing that your audience members will remember. I think the best stories involve repetition. It's weird. It builds anticipation and focuses an audience. If you kind of know what just happened, or if somebody's repeating what they just said, somehow it starts to, and the users start to anticipate what you're trying to say. I was at this, probably the best conference of my life. It was in Ireland a few years back, and it was in a castle, because I guess you put conferences in castles nowadays. And they had an actual storyteller come up from the small town. And that was his job title. I don't know if he had another job title, but he was storyteller of the town. And he'd been giving stories, he'd been telling stories for 3 or 4 decades. He'd done this a long time, and it was amazing to hear him talk. He just told a 10-minute story about some sort of ghost was in a house, and this guy would go up to the house, and he'd be like, oh, it's a ghost, and he'd go back down, and he'd talk to his friend. And he did this about 7 or 8 times. It doesn't necessarily seem like an exciting story, but how he was saying it was so fascinating. Because when the guy would come out of the house and he'd talk to his friend, he'd say 2 sentences the exact same every single time. So what happened there, after you hear 2 or 3 iterations of the story, you could start looking around people listening to this guy's story, and they start mouthing the exact words that the guy is about to say. And it was really fascinating, because you start anticipating, oh, I bet he goes up to the house next. What happens next? And it was fascinating. It's a really interesting, just an idea. I was really impressed with his just storytelling ability. And it's not a lot of complicated techniques he used. Winston Churchill, he's pretty good at speaking. I love this quote. If you have an important point to make, don't try to be subtle or clever. Use a pile driver. Hit the point once, then come back and hit it again. Then hit it a 3rd time, a tremendous whack. He had a great way with words. But if it's good enough for Churchill, it's good enough for you. Just say the same thing over and over again. It's a great way to just capture attention. Cool, so once you kind of know what you want to talk about, you have your outline maybe done, you have kind of a sketch, an idea of where you want to go. Usually at the end of all these sections, I'll do just a recap slide. And you see this in use at a lot of different places. Steve Jobs did this all the time. He would announce the cool new iPhone or something, and then at the end of the section, before he announced the next thing, he would have a recap slide of the price, what type of features he had just said. He'd go over this, and he spent 2 minutes of his time doing this. And he said this exact same stuff as he said before, but it was great because it grounded you. You knew exactly what the new product was that was being announced. So I think recap slides at the end of a section sort of grounds your audience so they know exactly what just happened and that they know that they're going to move on to the next section. So, to recap, you see, you like that? I'm telling you, this talk is so meta, it's awesome. To recap, start early. You can't start early enough. At least put some ideas down on paper so you can start mulling it over when you're walking to work or something. Be an expert on something. I think everybody has some sort of expertise that they can explain to other people. And I think that's awesome. And I think you just sort of have to sit back and say like, oh, what have I done the last year that I think is kind of interesting that other people might get a thrill out of or be interested in. Rule of 3, I think is great if you can just break your section out into 3 different parts. You can do certainly much more or much less. This is just the easiest way to do things that I've found, and easy is fantastic. And then finally, use repetition. Next, you actually have to build the thing. I'm going to do this a little bit different. I'm going to show you, kind of the good way of doing things and the bad way of doing things. So we're going to start out with this slide that I just made. Does anybody have any thoughts on this slide? Is this a good slide? Right, no one could read that. Turns out having slides that people can read, good stuff to do. So I say make your text huge. Really, like as big as you can possibly make it. I've never sat in a talk where I said at the end of the talk, oh, her slides, the text was so big I couldn't read it. It was ridiculous. I tuned out. I just left. It was ridiculous. But on the other hand, I've sat through probably 80% of every slide ever just saying, I'm an old man at this point, I guess. I don't know. My eyes are terrible sometimes, and bigger is better. I think you really can't get too big. It looks better big, and it limits you in a lot of really interesting ways, which I'll get into next. You usually hear this a lot. You say, oh, design it for the back of the room. So everyone back in that last row can probably see my text, I hope. I go a little bit step further, and I wish everyone could design it in the back of the room. I wish they had a 100-foot cord for the projector, and they sat in that last seat, and then literally just tried to design the slide from back there. Because if you can't see it, you're in trouble. I got a crack out of the new Apple TV that was released like a week or 2 ago, and that's pretty obvious that the designers did not design that to be used in the back of the room because they assume, they're at their computers 2 feet away from the screen. They have little tiny text. I'm like, this is supposed to be on a TV. What are you doing? Anyway, I'm very upset about this. I wish just use bigger text always. So cool, big text. Pretty awesome, right? No one can read that. It's still hard to read. Turns out contrast is a thing. I mean, you are all, designery focused people. You probably understand the idea of contrast. If you don't, it's very easy. Put dark stuff on light stuff or light stuff on dark stuff. Easiest thing in the world. As much pop you can give your text, the better it is, easier it is to be read. And it's not even like, even if you have the most glorious color choice in the world, sometimes you end up with just horrible projectors and they will destroy everything. So as much as possible, give your text as much contrast as possible. The other aspect of this I think developers tend to forget is that code can suffer from this as well. So if you have code on a slide like this, maybe you can see part of that, maybe you can't. It's far easier to read all of that if you see it like this. And I think that's kind of an interesting aspect. Like we're not building code right now. You can just put on text on the same color on a slide and it looks fine. What's more than that, then once it's all one color, you can start using color to focus this. So if I want to talk about the greatest tag of all time, I can say, hey, check out this tag. You know exactly what I'm talking about. If I want to talk about the content in here, I can sort of step through and highlight different things as I'm going through vocally about it. And kind of the cool part, you can actually just decrease the visibility of all the other text. And now it's really obvious I'm telling you all to rob a bank right now. You can totally do that. You don't have to set up your slides to look like an editor. I think that should be in your editor, not your talk. Again, you want your text to be as big as possible, most readable as possible, and you don't have to have your cool text-made color scheme on a slide necessarily. So cool. You got a little bit better color now, bigger text, looking good now. It's a little bit harder to read now, but it's legible. We're getting there. The next thing I would kind of suggest is choose fonts that are a little bit easier to read in the back of the room again. Sans-serifs are great for this, just because they tend to be a lot thicker. You can use serifs for this if you find the right serif font. Any sort of display font tends to look just really good on a slide. If you're cheap like me, Google Fonts has a whole bunch of really professionally designed great fonts you can use in your presentations. If you haven't heard of Lost Type Co-op, they're a really great site with 20 or so fonts, but they're really nicely designed. I think they're all open source, so you can contribute back to them. And they work. I found they work really, really well on slides. If you have no idea what any of this means, just use Helvetica. Like, people have been doing this since the 70s, and they just use Helvetica. No one's been fired for using Helvetica. Like, it's boring, but it's clear as hell. I like the look of it. Just use Helvetica. You'll look good. So cool, we got Helvetica. Everything looks great, right? Some people won't read all of that. I think as much as possible, you should remove as many words from a slide as possible. In fact, I could have just said that here. Just put remove words. What you want to do is you want to remove words because it places more emphasis on the words that are left. We would say this all the time when we were writing blog posts for GitHub. If you did a blog draft and you said, hey, I'm about to release this, what do you think about this? Usually what we would say is just, looks like a great draft, remove half the words. And it's not necessarily, it became kind of a jokey thing, but I think it's true. The more you pull stuff away, the more the rest stands alone. And more importantly, if I only had remove words on this slide, it forces you to listen to me a lot more. Isn't that kind of cool? Like, I can make you listen to me a lot more. Whereas before, you're stuck reading the slide. And you don't want your listeners to just be stuck reading slides all the time. You definitely don't want to be yourself. Sometimes the people will do and if you have 40 different words up there, you're much more encouraged to look at your stuff, and you turn their back to the audience, and pretty soon, who's even doing the talking? It's really ridiculous. And again, it's cool to encourage listening. You kind of force people to listen to all of your words as opposed to switching back from the slides to you, back to the slides to you. Cool. Now we're getting there. Does this look pretty good now? No, murder is frowned upon. No one mentioned this. Don't murder people. Jeez. Moving on. Images. Images are cool. I like images. They're pretty. Stuff like that. Usually people do stuff like this, or if they want to get fancy, they use the keynote, check it out, it's like a photo of my wall at home. There's a frame or something like that. Obviously, I think the problem here is you have a bunch of wasted space, and I don't think there's any reason why you can't just expand those photos out. I think that tends to look a lot better, especially if you're trying to explain a concept. You don't have to squint to try and read stuff. You can play around with it. You can make it black and white. You can add a pithy quote or something like that. There's a lot of very simple things you can do to make just images pop, look more interesting, less like a slide and more like a presentation, I guess. So the next thing I want to talk about is, hold on. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about, wait. All right. No, don't applaud this. This is horrible. I mean, though it may look very fancy, I tend to think that slide transitions are really stupid. Because now I have to wait for this to be done. It's just dumb. I think you should use them sparingly and purposefully. Besides that egregious example, I used it, I think, twice in this talk before. One when I was saying, put light text on black background, or dark black background on light text, and switched them around. I don't know what I said, but it was a nice, subtle way of emphasizing the idea that you can switch the two. So the advice I kind of like to give, if you must use a transition, do them and then just cut them in half. This is the same thing with CSS transitions or JavaScript animations. Just cut the duration in half, because otherwise you're sitting there waiting a half second for a transition that you know what's going to happen, and it just frustrates people. I get very upset about transitions. Okay, I want to take a second. Okay. So, we've just built cool stuff. Here's the recap. Basically, just use large readable text. It's amazing how much better you can be from anyone else who will get up on whatever meetup or conference stage that you'll be on. If you just increase the text size, reduce the amount of words as possible, and have people concentrate on your message rather than your slides. And you'll be so much better off than you would otherwise. So the last thing I want to talk about is actually giving the talk itself. There's a lot of weird aspects, speech when you think about it is just two flaps flapping and making noise. And there's a lot of really weird, subtle aspects of how to make that easier to get through. Because it can be really daunting, especially even with two people. It can be kind of frightening if you don't know them, much less all of you. I mean, luckily I'm in a theater with lots of lights, so I can't see you, and I think I'm just at home in my room right now, which is awesome. But there's a lot more other things to be kind of worried about or thinking about. One is just be excited or enthusiastic. I don't care if this is your first talk and you're not really good at speaking yet, just let your enthusiasm bleed through. I think there's so much stress surrounding, oh, I have to get up on stage, I have to make sure, like, I have pants on, and like, how am I going too fast? Am I going too slow? Are they interested? We kind of forget to let our enthusiasm for whatever we're talking about show through. And it doesn't really necessarily matter. Like, if you're spending the time to spend days or weeks or even sometimes months preparing a talk to deliver to somebody else, and I'm wasting 45 minutes of your time right now, I want it to be focused on something that's interesting to me. So just let that reflect and be really excited about stuff. Like, hey, I just found out this framework that saves me a day a week, and it's amazing. I want to share it to you. Or I think this is a huge injustice, and I want to talk about this, and I want to change it in your lives or my life or something. Just talk about that sort of stuff. And I think people react to that a lot better on stage than somebody just kind of just droning on. Like, oh, we saved 30,000 lines of code today. And it's like, that's amazing. You should talk about it. The thing that I don't think people are very comfortable saying is that talks are entertainment. I think, hopefully they're informational as well, but the art of, just telling stories vocally. We've been doing this for thousands and thousands of years. There's a reason we do this as opposed to sitting in our rooms right now reading blog posts or something like that. It's that you have an opportunity to show somebody visually or auditorially, say, yes, I'm excited about this. This is what I think is important in our industry. And the real question, I think, particularly in our industry, is just ask yourself, is your talk better than a blog post? Because sometimes blog posts are great, especially if you're trying to detail some really, really low-level, hard-to-conceptualize stuff, and you just need to throw a lot of code at the problem and say, okay, I'm just going to write a blog post. I'm going to write a README. I'm going to put this in a discussion list. Try to use talks as a way of sharing experiences. Again, tell a story as opposed to saying, this is the problem, this is a solution. Say, oh, this is what we went through trying to figure out a solution. That's the really exciting part. Practicing is kind of the next thing you have to do. At some point, you should go through your talk before telling other people this, because otherwise, who knows what you'll say on stage. Rehearsing a bunch. That's worth saying. It's totally fine to go over this 5, 10, 15 times by yourself or with friends or whatever the case is. The more practiced you are, the more confident and relaxed you'll be on stage. And for me, the more I practice, the more I get bored with my own talk, and the more my brain starts trying to make it funny or interesting for me on stage, and it becomes kind of a better talk that way. Rather than just kind of monotonely, expressing what I've written down in the past, I can start improvising and making a real talk. A good example to help you out with this is record yourself. People say this all the time. Make a recording of you practicing your talk, and it's really, really embarrassing. Everybody hates listening to themselves, but it's amazing what you pick up, like the little tiny pauses, or maybe you really like some of the stuff you're saying. You didn't realize you were that good of a speaker, and you didn't give yourself enough credit. Seeing yourself on screen and actually forcing yourself to sit through the entire 30 minutes, really helpful in trying to figure out how you become better at the idea you're trying to tell to other people. The next thing I try to do, especially if it's a conference and I'm like in the room going to give a talk somewhere I haven't before, is to try to scope out the room and try and figure out, okay, what are certain setups in the room going to be? How is that going to impact my talk? So one thing you want to do is check the mic. This is a nice mic to have because I can do this. I can drink in the middle of it and stuff. Sometimes you have the hand mic, which means then if I have a remote, then I have to juggle stuff and it's confusing. Sometimes there's no mics if you're in a meetup or something like that and you have to talk really loudly. These are all things that are worth worrying about ahead of time if you have time to do it. Also check the microphone if you have one of these and you go to the bathroom. I've heard that once, somebody flushing a toilet and then it broadcasts. That's unfortunate, don't do that. Something that's kind of sneaky sometimes is projector cord location. If you're in a venue like this, it's a lot easier because they usually have a much better setup. But if you're in a small meetup or if you're in a company that doesn't really give these talks very much, usually projector's in the back, and your laptop has to be attached to that projector somehow, so they put the laptop in the back as well. And that can be scary or surprising if all of your notes are on your computer and you need that to give a talk. Sometimes that means you have to print out your notes ahead of time or put it on your phone or borrow another computer, but that's just another thing that's worth noting ahead of time. Room size is surprisingly a big deal as well. in a big room like this, as lots of speakers have noticed, you echo a lot, and it's kind of cool. But it also has a lot of different influences on other things. Like, since this is a bigger room, I think you're a little bit less interactive than you would be if we were tucked into one tiny room. And even the lights are off, which means I think you're a little bit less, ready to go like, yeah, you preach it or something like that. I've noticed that in like much smaller rooms, people tend to be a little bit more outspoken, especially if you're asking questions and answer sections. If you're in a gigantic room like this and you have a Q&A session at the end of your talk, that can be difficult to try and get people to give you questions. So again, that's kind of worth at least making a note of and say, okay, is this something that's going to freak me out, or is this something that I know ahead of time and I can work with that? Lighting is good again. Again, I can't see you at all. So you may have all left at this point and stopped listening to me, which is cool because I can't tell. So that's kind of worth making a note of, and especially if you're at a conference with good lighting, it becomes less stressful a little bit. Culturalisms is kind of an interesting thing too. I was giving a talk in a new country in a programming language that I don't use. It's a little bit more enterprisey, and somebody came up ahead of time saying, "Oh, I know your type of talks. Don't be worried if people don't laugh out loud. That's just kind of my culture. That's like the culture of the programming language that we're in." And I was like, okay, I'm pretty funny. People are going to laugh for me. And then sure enough, nobody laughed. And it was a little bit disarming. I was like, oh man, what am I doing? Did I mess up or something? And then afterwards, everyone came up and said, that was the funniest talk I've ever seen. And they were like, today. And I was like, okay, that's cool. Should have just laughed. So again, that's like, it's not even like country culture or anything like that. Sometimes if you're at a corporate event, it can be a lot more professional and more uptight. Sometimes if you're at a meetup, people may already be drunk in the audience, so they're very loose and very engaged and positive. Just another thing, you just sort of make a note of the audience and see how they feel like. On stage has a bunch of other different aspects to be worried about. Try and bring an adapter. Assume all projectors are from 1946 and are incapable of doing anything interesting. Projectors are the worst things in the world. So always bring an adapter, even if you know other people are there with your same laptop, or if they aren't. It's always helpful to make sure that you at least have your own bases covered. Charge up. I've seen this a number of times where somebody's deep into the code and they're telling lots of things, and you get the, oh my god, I got 10 minutes till my battery. Like, give me some power really quick, and then it's kind of embarrassing. Don't be that. Use a remote. I do this a lot. I don't tend to walk around a whole bunch on stage very much. I'm too insecure, so I kind of sit behind my podium so you can't see me as much. But it's still helpful because otherwise you have to hit the space bar or hit the next arrows, and it's really complicated. This is just easier. I can keep my hands down or up and press next. Don't use the Apple remote in your the old IR remote or your iPhone because internet will never work. And trying to use your phone to change slides is dumb. Just get one of these. It's super cheap. One of these is also good because you have lasers, and lasers are awesome. And the best part, if I laser right here, all of your heads just turn that way, and I can laser over here. So that has no bearing on your talk. It's just really cool. Turn your phone off. Kind of a small thing, especially if you're vibrating in the meantime. Everyone's got the back channel and you're all talking shit about me right now. And if my phone was on, it would be buzzing the whole time, and I'd have to check it and be like, oh man, there's somebody who said, puppy dog 22 is angry at me, and it's just a distraction. Assume the internet wants to kill you. Most venues, especially in a larger place, even if the conference says, yeah, we have internet, we've spent millions of dollars for you to sit in the audience and go on the internet, it's never going to work because it's a conference and it's horrible. So especially don't try and live demo or do anything on the internet unless you're really sure that the internet is fantastic and awesome and will never go down. The internet will always go down though, so. As part of that, be wary of live demos. I tend to just say don't do live demos ever. If you're really practiced at it, if you've done it before, if you're good at it, that's awesome. It's really great to see. But I've seen some really, really amazing talks of pseudo live demos. They've pre-recorded it in the past, and they do these quick 2-minute, they're typing in, they're doing everything that they would on a live demo otherwise. But in the meantime, they don't have to worry about it because once you get up on stage, your mind will blank out and you won't even know where you are, much less know how to add a semicolon at the end of a line in JavaScript, which is ridiculous. Don't ever do that. Live demos, where was I going with this? Don't do them, I think. I think it's much easier to just pre-record them, talk over them. Much fewer things will go wrong, and I think from an audience perspective, it's totally fine. Like, no one's going to sit back and say, like, oh, will this work in real life? Like, no, I'm not lying to you. It's just like pre-recorded. It's fine. Nervousness is kind of the elephant in the room. Obviously, you're going to get nervous. You're going to talk to a lot of other people, and you can make yourself look like a fool if you aren't worried about this sort of thing. That's fine. I think the best thing about nerves is realizing that they're actually kind of awesome. Like, when I'm really nervous, my brain kind of works in overdrive, and I can think about things a little bit faster than I could otherwise. So don't necessarily be scared about being nervous. It's kind of a nice thing. Kind of the best part about this to deal with it is just breathing. Like, literally, people forget to breathe sometimes. And it does two things, like it gives you oxygen, but it also, if you breathe really slowly, you lower your heartbeat a little bit, you calm down. It's like a nice way to sort of deal with these sort of pre-talk nerves or during talk nerves. Take breaks. The best thing, water is awesome. So if I do this, no one's like, hurry up, because obviously you aren't that mean, and like, obviously I'm just drinking a piece of water. It's fine. But it's a great way to sort of say, oh man, I'm going to take a break, and you can think about stuff. I was thinking about what shirt I want to buy in the next couple of days for this wedding. But you don't know that. You think I'm like really deep into my talk and trying to figure out how to teach you these people or something. It's a nice break for yourself mentally more than anything else. Also, water's delicious. So nerves are a really good thing. I think they kind of increase and get you excited and kind of pumped up to tell people stuff. It's cool. Another kind of trick that I think really good public speakers are good at is just variance. And it's not necessarily being one thing or another. It's kind of being the scope of all that sort of stuff. I think monotone is the fast track to boring. You've seen the robots on stage where they say like, yeah, npm install, do this and stuff. And it's boring. Nobody really wants to listen to that. It's like the same thing if you're a musician, if you're in an orchestra or something. Sometimes you have to play really soft. Sometimes you have to play really loud. And those two alone, they don't really mean much. It's like, okay, you're cool, you're playing loud. Oh, now cool, you're playing soft. It's the dynamic range between the two that's the really exciting part. So there's a lot of things you can vary. One thing that I think is really, really exciting is pausing. Even then, probably people in the front row are like, oh God, is he going to call on me? Do I have to do something? Like, it gets people engaged if you just say, especially if you have a stage like this and you start walking down and you start looking at the front row and you're like, is there any volunteers? And everyone's freaking out and no one really knows what's going on. So it's the best thing. It's like two different things. A pause will make sure people will listen to you, what you're going to say next. And B, a pause gives you a break. I can just kind of sit there and say, I think JavaScript's silly. And I just kind of let it sit there, It's kind of a nice way to do it. Volume's another easy one. I can get really loud if I'm really excited about something, or I can go really soft and I think JavaScript's really silly. And I think people kind of catch on to that. It's a nice thing to go back and forth between that. Same thing, if I want to go really fast, I think really, I can't even say that fast. Faster things, or if you want to go really slow and drive a point through, that type of variance, exciting for people. Movement, if you want to move your hands around, if you want to walk around the stage, use your laser pointer or something, that type of variance is really nice. Kind of gives your eyes something to do as well. Lots of things you can kind of vary. It's awesome. Something I also want to talk about next is when things go wrong. Especially if it's your first time giving a talk, things will break all around you and it's going to be horrible. It's just going to let you know now. Here's a bunch of things that can break. Your battery, if you didn't charge your laptop, it will probably be dead and you're going to have to deal with it. Fonts, if you're presenting on somebody else's laptop, they might not have the right fonts for you, and then that's going to be a disaster. Kernel panics, I've seen this happen before. People's laptop just freeze up, thanks Apple, and now you have to restart in front of everyone, and it's really embarrassing. Colors might be wrong on a projector because projectors are horrible. Sound might not be wired up if you don't have really good sound people. The internet is always trying to kill you. It's horrible. Notifications is a good one. Turn on Do Not Disturb or something, because I don't want to see your text messages pop up in the middle of a talk. And that can be weird sometimes. Gravity I've seen happen a couple of times where somebody's like excited, they get called up to the stage and literally drop their laptop. It's like, yeah, you got to hold on to that sort of stuff. And then finally, projectors are the worst thing in the world. So be worried about all those sort of things. All these things can go wrong. It happens. There's a lot of things you can do to sort of make sure you're prepared for that. A, have a copy of your slides. And kind of more importantly, make sure they're accessible. Like I always have this fear, or I'm going to be in a country and I have like my laptop, my iPad, and my phone with me, and then like I get mugged or I fall off the side of the road and like I lose everything and I have no way to get my talk. That's the one thing I'm worried about is my talk or something, much less dying. So have your slides somewhere, hopefully publicly accessible. If you lose like all of your devices and all of your passwords are in like one password or something like that, make sure you can access them even though you don't have access to everything else. So that's really helpful. Bring adapters, again, make sure you have power and all those sorts of things. But mostly just roll with it. It's totally fine. You'll understand that at the end of the day, like computers are the worst thing ever invented, but humans really understand this sort of thing. And I think that's the most comforting thing that I've sort of realized over the time. I have a friend who gave a talk a couple years back, and she's a good speaker, but she got up in front of the stage in a conference, and literally everything went wrong. Like she plugged in her laptop, immediately kernel panicked. The projector was all set up wrong. Her slides like didn't fully come in. Like Keynote just decided like, nah, I don't want to display these sorts of things. And then she ended up having to like start her talk with the presenter display, and she had her notes down there. It just wasn't really going well. It was like everything that could possibly go wrong went wrong. And eventually, after like a couple minutes, the conference organizers went up to her and was like, we'll just skip you. We'll go to the next person, and we'll come back the next time. She put her presentation on a friend's laptop, went up, it was totally fine. The reason I bring this up is that literally nobody in the audience was like, what an idiot, couldn't plug in this stuff, like couldn't realize that, Keynote kernel panics your machine all the time. Like, what an idiot. Like nobody said that. Everyone was like, oh, computers, how ridiculous. And by the time she went back up on stage, it was totally fine. And that's like an example of, the worst fears come true, but it really didn't matter because, sometimes these things happen. So if anything kind of comes up in the middle of your talk, you just kind of roll with it. The first time I gave this talk, the fire alarm went off in the middle of it, which is not something I prepared for necessarily. We all just decided not to go outside, and so, I don't know, I could have been the last thing they heard, which would have been kind of awesome. But these things happen. You just kind of roll with it and see how things go. The last little bit I want to talk about is questions and answers. If you're at a conference or especially a meetup who do like questions and answers, especially like business meeting, if you're doing a presentation to a client or something, you're going to have to deal with questions and answers. Particularly in like the conference sort of perspective, like we aren't doing Q&A here, but if we did do Q&A after this talk, the big fear here is like, well, what if you don't know the answer to that question? If you're giving a talk about a framework, what happens if the framework inventor is sitting in the front row and you have to deal with whatever nitpicky thing that you screwed up? The best advice is just you pause, you think about the question, and then you say this, I don't know. That's totally cool. Like, why would you say something that you don't know the answer to and try and pass it off like you do? For me, when I'm sitting in the audience and seeing this happen, it's like instant, like, I love you. Like, that's fantastic. Because on the flip side, people in the audience know when you're bullshitting. If you're trying to say like, oh yeah, well, clearly you should do this in this circumstance and blah, 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 and everyone's just like, why are you're wasting our time now. Just say I don't know and it's fine. Totally cool. The other aspect of this is dealing with jerks, trolls, whoever in the audience. The person who like puts their hand up and then they deliver like a 5-minute treatise on why you're wrong and everything's terrible. It happens from time to time. Usually not. Most people are pretty nice. But mostly, remember you have the microphone, you're on stage, you can kind of control whatever people do. I saw this happen once where somebody was going on and on and on, and then finally the speaker was just like, do you have an actual question? And then everyone just started applauding. It was fantastic because the audience probably hates the guy too. So, I mean, again, just be honest. Like, if you don't know something, I don't know. If somebody's being a meanie, just say, do you have a question? Or if you're nicer, you say, we'll just take this offline. I'll meet you in the hall, and we can have a real discussion about this, or I can learn from wherever I did wrong. And that's totally fine. It's a nice way to sort of deal with this sort of stuff. So finally, like the last little bits is like what happens when you do a talk, what happens afterwards. I would put your slide deck somewhere, especially if you're doing something in kind of the tech industry at a conference or something like that. Speaker deck is probably the best place for it, other than like SlideShare, but there's a bunch of different places. A lot of people do like blog posts and then detail their talk. The whole point of this is that other people, and a lot of the times when you're at a conference, even a big conference might be like 1,000 people, it's more likely that you'll reach a bigger audience online. So it's nice to be able to share your slides and your thoughts that way as well. It's like two birds with one stone. It's a nice way to do that sort of stuff. Do a write-up is great. I've noticed when I'm giving a talk for the first time, it's also kind of nice to do a companion blog post to get in a little bit more gritty detail about what I just talked about. And since it's in your mind, it's really fresh from the talk that you just gave, it should be a really, really easy blog post to write for you. Watch the recording. And again, it's really great to see yourself. It's also really horrible to see yourself, but you learn a lot. I look at myself all the time, not all the time, after my talks, and I realize I say a lot, and then I do stuff usually in a talk right afterwards, and I'll be like, and it's horrible. So I try to work on stuff like that, but I wouldn't notice that unless I watched myself give these sorts of talks. Finally, do it again and again and again. It's easy to get kind of bored hearing yourself talk about the same thing over and over again, but it's amazing. Most people, unless you're giving the same talk in the same city like every week, most people probably haven't seen your talk before. And B, like hopefully your talk grows as you grow. And as you've picked up new techniques with whatever framework you're maybe discussing, you can put that in your talk and it becomes like a living, breathing, growing thing. And that's totally fun. And you just get better at this sort of stuff the more you do it. So to recap, be excited. It's totally cool to be enthusiastic about what you're talking about. Practice a whole bunch. Practice makes perfect. The more you speak, the better you are at it. It's just like anything else you'll ever do. Use variance, motion, volume, speed, whatever the case is. That makes for a little bit more interesting for the audience members. And finally, roll with the punches. Things will go wrong, and that's totally cool. People will understand. So finally, public speaking is scary. That's kind of the reason why I get up on stage. And I think people tend to realize that, yeah, this is potentially a kind of a freaky thing. But it can be fun. And the number of times where I've talked to somebody who is about to give their first talk and they're like, I'm never going to do this again. This is so much work. This is dumb. And then I talk to them after their talk and they're just like, I'm jacked up. This is awesome. I can do anything right now. It's kind of fun to hit that point, and it's kind of an exciting thing. And as the saying goes, you don't really know something until you try to teach somebody else. If you ever sat down with somebody and tried to teach them a line of code that you just wrote, you find yourself, you don't really understand it unless you've really thought, like, okay, how do I describe this to them? And then you start learning on your own sense, and it just helps perpetuate, and you become smarter and smarter and better and better. So public speaking, anything you do is just a learned skill. Even the best speakers they had to start somewhere and just keep practicing, and it's a fun little thing to do. So that's all I've got. Thanks.